The morning sun over Naval Base San Diego was already brutal, a white-hot hammer pounding the tarmac of the massive parade ground. The date was seared into the memory of every soul present. March 15th. 2,000 troops stood in rigid formation, a sea of starched white uniforms and polished brass, the silence so profound that the distant crash of the Pacific surf against the pier pilings could be heard. It was a full military inspection, and a ritual of power and discipline where careers were made and broken by the smallest detail, a smudge on a boot, a thread loose on a shoulder board. Presiding over this theater of authority was Rear Admiral James T. Hollister. He was a man carved from the old Navy, a plank owner who believed command was a divine right bestowed upon the few. At 60, with a chest full of medals from a career that had largely been administrative, he projected an aura of infallibility. His face, permanently fixed in a scowl, was the last thing many junior officers wanted to see. He stalked the lines like a predator, his white uniform immaculate, his pace slow and deliberate. The troops held their breath as he passed, his eyes scanning for imperfections with the malice of a man who enjoyed the fear he instilled. Among the thousands stood a figure that seemed to defy the very notion of a warrior. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Jenkins was small, barely 5'4", with a lean, almost wiry frame that was lost in her standard-issue uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painted to her scalp, and her face, free of makeup, was tanned and weathered. She held her position at the end of a supply company, a unit far from the front-line prestige of the infantry. To the Admiral and to the 1,999 other troops present, she was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a paper pusher, a logistician, an administrative afterthought. Hollister's inspection of the supply company was cursory, dismissive. He grunted at the company commander, barely glanced at the equipment manifests, and was about to move on when his gaze snagged on Jenkins. It wasn't her uniform that caught his eye. It was her posture. While others stood rigid with anxiety, she stood with a different kind of stillness. It was the calm of a predator at rest, a coiled efficiency that, to a less arrogant man, might have signaled danger. To Hollister, it looked like insolence. He saw a woman, small and quiet, and his antiquated mind made a simple calculation: weak link, a blemish on his perfect parade ground. He stopped directly in front of her. The silence became electric. The 2,000 troops, sensing the shift in atmosphere, remained frozen, but their peripheral vision was locked on the drama unfolding. "What's your name, sailor?" Hollister's voice boomed, a weapon he wielded with precision. Jenkins's eyes remained fixed on a point 1,000 yards away, her voice steady and clear. "Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Jenkins, sir." Hollister leaned in, his face inches from hers. He could smell the starch in her collar. "You think you're something special, Jenkins? You think because you can stand there with that blank look, you're above all this?" "No, sir," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral. Hollister smirked, and turning slightly to ensure his entourage and nearby troops could hear. "Look at you, a woman in a man's navy playing dress-up. You belong behind a desk pushing pencils for someone who can actually fight. You're a waste of a uniform and a waste of taxpayer money." He was waiting for a reaction, a flush of anger, a tear of humiliation, a trembling lip. He got none. Jenkins's expression didn't flicker. This infuriated him. The lack of fear was an insult to his authority. He stepped back, and his voice rising to a shout meant to carry across the entire formation. "You are a disgrace! A little brat playing soldier while real men are out there doing the work. You don't have the right to stand on the same ground as these warriors." The word brat hung in the air. It was the final degrading straw. The insult was so petty, so beneath the dignity of his rank, that it broke an unspoken code. 2,000 troops winced internally, but Jenkins remained a statue. Hollister, enraged by her composure, made a catastrophic error in judgment. He was used to total compliance. He reached out and, with the flat of his hand, gave her a sharp shove in the shoulder. It was a strike meant to knock her off balance, to physically demonstrate her fragility. "You little brat! Are you even listening to me?" The shove connected. Jenkins's body barely moved. It was as if he had pushed a concrete pillar. But something else moved. Something in the air around her shifted. And it was invisible, but palpable. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature, a tension so thick it felt like a physical force. In that split second, 2,000 years of combined military service among the watching troops sensed it. It was the look. The one you see in the eyes of men who have walked through the valley of the shadow and brought the fight back with them. Jenkins's gaze, which had been fixed on the horizon, snapped to Hollister's face. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, ancient assessment. And it was the look of a wolf suddenly realizing the dog barking at it has no teeth. Hollister saw it. For the first time in decades, a cold bolt of primal fear shot through the Admiral. His hand, the one that had just struck her, hung in the air, suddenly feeling very heavy and very wrong. The moment was broken by a sound, a high-pitched electronic chirp. It was coming from the small backpack at Jenkins's feet, a standard-issue satchel that Hollister had assumed held paperwork. Jenkins didn't look down. She knew the sound. An officer from the command staff, a Captain Miller who had been trailing Hollister, stepped forward. His face was pale. He knew the protocol for that chirp. It was a restricted frequency, a priority communication from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. "Lieutenant," Captain Miller said, his voice hesitant. Your pack?" Hollister, desperate to regain control, scoffed. "Never mind that. I'm not finished here." But Jenkins finally moved. With a fluid grace that was unnerving, she bent down, unzipped the satchel, and pulled out a bulky, encrypted satellite phone. She answered it, her voice dropping to a low, clipped murmur. "Bravo 7. Go ahead." She listened for 10 seconds. "Copy. Out." She slipped the phone back into the bag and stood at attention, facing the Admiral. The silence was deafening. The chirp had scrambled the base's communication network. And a nervous young lieutenant from the Signals Corps ran over to Captain Miller, handing him a tablet. On it was the ID trace from the call. Captain Miller looked at the screen. His jaw went slack. He looked from the tablet to Jenkins and then to the Admiral. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Sir," Miller whispered to Hollister, his voice trembling, "I need to speak with you, now." Hollister, flustered, stepped aside with Miller. Miller showed him the tablet and spoke in a rapid, hushed tone. As he spoke, the color drained from Hollister's face. The arrogant red flush was replaced by a waxy, sickly pallor. He looked over at Jenkins, and this time, there was no malice in his eyes, only disbelief, and the dawning horror of a man who has just realized he has voluntarily stepped off a cliff. He walked back to Jenkins, his steps unsteady. The 2,000 troops watched, utterly transfixed. "Lieutenant?" "Jenkins," Hollister began, his voice now a hoarse whisper that didn't carry. I was not aware." Jenkins's voice was quiet, but it carried the same cold steel as her gaze. "Aware of what, Admiral?" He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Your file. It says here you're attached to supply, but your permanent record, your operational history." He trailed off. He couldn't bring himself to say it in front of the troops. But the tablet in Miller's hand told the story. Yeah, it listed her real designation. Operator. It listed her awards. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor, 2 Joint Service Commendation Medals, and a Presidential Unit Citation. It listed her deployments, 13 in total, all to active combat zones. And it listed her unit affiliation, a nondescript three-letter designation that every person in the military knew but never spoke aloud. It was a Tier 1 Special Missions Unit, the unit that operated in the shadows, the unit that didn't officially exist. And Jenkins was not a supply officer. She was a Senior Chief Special Warfare Operator, a Navy SEAL, one of the most highly decorated and experienced special operators in the entire United States military. She had more combat time in the mountains of Afghanistan and the alleys of Iraq than Hollister had days at sea. She had killed more men with her bare hands than Hollister had ever commanded. She was, in the truest sense of the word, a legend. And the title First Female Navy SEAL was debated in the media, but in the closed world of special operations, her name was spoken with reverence. She had passed the same brutal training as her male counterparts, completed the same impossible missions, and bled the same blood. And now, a Rear Admiral, in front of 2,000 witnesses, had just physically assaulted her and called her a little brat. The silence stretched on, an unbearable weight pressing down on the parade ground. And the 2,000 troops who had just witnessed the most senior officer in their theater strike a subordinate were now witnessing the aftermath. They didn't know the details, but they could see the Admiral's face. They knew something monumental had just happened. Finally, Jenkins spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every single soul in that formation. It was the voice of command, honed in chaos and baptized in fire. Admiral Hollister, you struck a superior officer. The words were a logical impossibility. A lieutenant cannot be superior to an admiral. And yet, the way she said it made it an undeniable fact. She was speaking of a hierarchy far older and more primal than rank, the hierarchy of the warrior. She had seen combat. He had not. She had earned her place through blood. He had earned his through politics. I didn't know, Hollister stammered, the great admiral reduced to a stuttering mess. No, as you didn't, Jenkins agreed. You saw a woman in a uniform and you made an assumption. You let your arrogance write a check your rank can't cash. She took a single step forward. Hollister flinched, actually flinched, stepping back a half step. 2,000 jaws dropped. They had just seen an admiral recoil from a lieutenant. You have publicly humiliated yourself, Jenkins continued, her voice like chipping ice. You have demonstrated a profound lack of judgment and a complete failure of leadership. You have discredited this uniform and everything it stands for. She turned her head slightly, addressing Captain Miller, who was still standing frozen with the tablet in his hand. Captain Miller, I believe Article 89 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice prohibits the use of contemptuous words by a commissioned officer against a superior commissioned officer. It also, I believe, covers conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, or in this case, an admiral. Miller could only nod, his mouth dry. Jenkins turned back to Hollister. The predator had fully emerged from the shadows. I will be filing a formal complaint, Admiral. It will go to the Secretary of the Navy, the Joint Chiefs, and every news outlet that will listen. You did this in front of 2,000 witnesses. You did it in the digital age, and which means there are already 17 cell phone videos of it on servers in this country. She was right. Despite the ban on phones in formation, the spectacle had been too much. Hidden cameras had been rolling. The story was already exploding across social media. Your career is over, Admiral, Jenkins said, her final words carrying no satisfaction, only a statement of fact. It ended the moment your hand touched my shoulder. Now, if you'll excuse me, and I have a briefing at the Pentagon in 4 hours. She didn't salute. She didn't ask for permission. She simply bent down, picked up her satchel, and walked away. She walked through the stunned formation of 2,000 troops, who parted for her like the Red Sea. As she passed, a young Marine, a corporal with a combat patch on his sleeve, instinctively snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. He didn't do it for her rank. He did it for what she was. The story broke like a tsunami. Within hours, the video was on every major news channel. The Pentagon was in damage control mode within minutes. The hashtag you little brat trended globally, not as an insult, but as a rallying cry against toxic leadership. Admiral Hollister was placed on administrative leave by sundown. The official investigation was swift. Dozens of sailors and officers came forward with their own stories of his arrogance and abuse. The Navy, facing a public relations nightmare, moved with uncharacteristic speed. Within 2 weeks, Hollister was given a choice: retire quietly with a reduced pension or face a full court-martial for conduct unbecoming and assault. He chose retirement. As for Jenkins, she became an unwilling icon. The Navy, trying to spin the disaster, initially tried to use her as a recruitment poster, but they quickly realized they had no control over her. She didn't do interviews. She didn't pose for photos. When the Secretary of the Navy himself called to offer his apologies and ask how the Navy could make it right, her response was legendary in the corridors of the Pentagon. Make it right by ensuring that no other officer, man or woman, ever has to be physically assaulted to prove their worth. Do your job so that the uniform means something again. She didn't return to the supply unit. She was quietly reassigned, her official record sealed even tighter than before. She vanished back into the world she came from, the world of shadows and silent professionals. A month after the incident, Jenkins was in a forward operating base in a location that didn't exist on any map. She was dressed in non-standard gear, her face painted, preparing for a night mission. A young Navy corpsman, fresh out of training, was nervously checking her medical kit. He had heard the rumors, the whispers. He finally gathered the courage to ask, "Chief, is it true? About the Admiral?" "At the parade ground." Jenkins finished checking her weapons chamber, the metallic click definitive in the quiet of the bunker. She looked at the young man, her eyes holding the weight of 1,000 stories he would never know. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. "That was a different lifetime, Doc," she said, her voice soft in the desert night. "Focus up. We have work to do." And with that, she turned and melted into the darkness, leaving behind the glare of the parade ground and the echoes of a foolish man's words, returning to the only place she had ever truly belonged. The legend of the little brat grew, a story told in hushed tones in mess halls and briefing rooms, a permanent reminder that in the military, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who has nothing to prove.